Hello and welcome to episode 2. Thank you for watching today. As promised last time, we're going to talk about COVID today, whether you're sick of it or not. And we really want to look today at what does the Bible say about COVID. And the first thing we want to do is just to say that COVID is real. This is kind of a political hot button issue, I think. And we're not here to try to give you a hard political statement. We all, of course, have our own personal opinions. But what we're here to do is to try to shine some light on the subject from the Bible. But first, we just want to acknowledge that it is real. And just to throw a few stats out there to give us perspective on this current pandemic, there were 43.5 million cases recorded worldwide to date. 43.5 million cases. 1.1 million deaths, according to Johns Hopkins University. And you can agree or disagree about how those things are recorded, but the fact is many, many untold numbers of people are affected by this pandemic. In the news also, 720 new cases right here in Ireland yesterday. That's 720 new cases. Over 58,700 cases total, and 5 deaths yesterday attributed to COVID. And to date, over 18, close to 1,900 deaths here in Ireland. And even one death is tragic, but these deaths are having an impact on people. And so, whether we're directly affected by death or sickness or indirectly affected by the lockdown, by all of the things that, are affecting us related to the pandemic, we're all impacted in some way. And we all have different reactions to these things, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But what is the overall reaction that every person has? And Oriel and I have been talking about it here. Yeah. And it seems obvious that in the news, talking with our friends, with our family and acquaintances, just among ourselves here, I think the overarching reaction that we have is fear. Yes. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Everybody fears something. Mm-hmm. And they may not all be the same fears, but fear really is just not knowing what the future holds for us. Mm-hmm. And, we're not omniscient people. We aren't God. We don't know what tomorrow holds. We don't even know really what today holds. And so just this uncertainty of knowing the future puts fear in us when we think that anything could happen. It tends to create anxiety in the heart, some nervousness, and fear. Mm-hmm. And so the overarching reaction, I think, to the pandemic is fear. And, Oriel, the Bible speaks to fear.
Yes, a lot.
It does.
Because I think it's part of the human condition. We all face fear over various things in our lives. And the Bible has a lot to say about it.
Right. So. And there are a few categories of fear that we could talk about. And one is fear of death. Everybody has a fear of death. And think about elderly people who are at risk of catching COVID and maybe fearing death. And, what's going to happen after death? It makes people think, what's going to happen when I die? What happens to my family? What happens to me when I die? And so people have a fear of death. And one pandemic expert described himself as shaken, very scared, and shocked. And how many people in our society today does that describe? Shaken, very scared, and shocked. That certainly describes some people.
And Steve, I've even heard accounts of people who, just consumed with fear, especially as they, day and day in the news, as you hear how many people are sick, how many people are dying. And I've heard accounts of people who actually ended their lives just in despair, ended their own lives. Terrible. So there's just such fear out there surrounding the coronavirus at this time. It's very sad.
Yeah, I mean, there's fear that affects us in general. But then you add on the stress of a pandemic. And everything related to it, and it just heightens our sense of fear that we have, and it has all kinds of physical, emotional, spiritual effects on us. There is the fear of death. There's also other fears, particularly right now, economic loss. I mean, this
Yeah,
is a
yeah.
huge fear that I think strikes it across all levels of society. And this has also been in the news. And
Yeah.
news articles have been talking about this growing divide between those who are affected by the lockdowns and those who aren't. And there's an increasing dissatisfaction with people who are losing out and really losing their businesses, losing their livelihoods, seeing
Yeah.
their family savings gone, seeing their retirements maybe being depleted, just losing their businesses. These are tough, hard times that we're
Yeah.
living in.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard that it's the industries that have many people employed, and particularly the younger generation, that
Yeah.
are being hit hardest.
Yeah.
It's the service industry.
Steve,
It's
aren't you saying this? We heard a figure that 50% of young people in one age bracket are unemployed right now.
I think
It's
I just read that on the
huge,
news.
like,
50% of people out of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom. And
Yeah.
that's a huge economic hit
Yeah,
on the country.
I just went to a little office shop in Gorey where I live, and just a couple of months ago, I'd bought some files and stuff in there. Went to go there the other day. Place is closed down.
Yeah.
Out of business, and not temporarily, like they're gone.
Not
and
coming
so
back.
many small businesses, and just the trauma for the business owners, for the people who've lost jobs.
Yeah.
It's affecting people.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Economic loss. Michal Martin said that this pandemic is affecting large sections of life and economy. He had his speech just the other day, and he made mention to this. So this is in the news. The government's thinking about this. The common average person is thinking about this. And you can go read comments under
Yeah.
these news stories, and you can just see and read the fear and anxiety that people have, really the frustration with the way the government's handling this,
Yeah.
whether they agree or don't agree. Maybe you agree, don't agree. But there is some level of frustration and just the feeling of uncertainty that the government doesn't have this under control.
Yeah.
And this is, in fact, what Michal Martin said in his speech. He said, there are no laws or powers that can change the nature of this virus. And Oriel, what that tells me is, here's the top government official here in Ireland
Yeah.
expressing what many world leaders say, and that's that we just don't have the power to control this thing.
Yes.
We can try to
Yeah.
set limitations and things in society, but at the end of the day, we really have no control over this
Yeah.
virus. This is kind of an unseen enemy that we
Yeah.
have, and we don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, and I think it has to be said too. I don't envy any of the world governments as they try to figure this out.
No.
I mean, I know we can criticize what the government's doing, and sometimes that's in order, but it's a losing battle. They don't quite know what they're dealing with. No one totally understands the coronavirus, and people are trying. Governments are trying to do what they can, but it's out of their control. It's beyond our control.
Yeah, and even health experts are disagreeing
Yeah.
about the right course of action. Of course, everyone wants this to go away, and
Yeah.
they don't want businesses to be shut down, and
Yeah.
we want to get the economy going again. But the fact is there is no clear magic solution.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to what we want to talk about today. And I asked last week, does the Bible say anything about the coronavirus? And the obvious answer is no, it doesn't. The coronavirus didn't exist back in Bible times, but pandemics did, and plagues and diseases did. And so, Oriel, is there anything that the Bible can shed light on that we're dealing with today?
Well, yeah, I've been thinking about that, over the last while, and what comes to my mind is in Egypt, the 10 plagues that we see recorded in the book of Exodus. And you think of Egypt, Egypt was the world power of its day in many ways. It was an advanced society, a wealthy society, and yet the 10 plagues came in, and the story is recorded in Exodus chapter 5 through 12 in the Bible. And it really upended a very advanced civilization. but it's actually very instructive. And people have gone through things like we're going through with the coronavirus through history, but the Bible tells us what God is often up to in those times, and how we can respond in a way that can help us. You may be familiar with, Steve, I'm sure you are, but I'll just kind of go over the thumbnail of the 10 plagues. God sends Moses to Egypt. He confronts Pharaoh and says, I want you to let my people, the children of Israel, go. And Pharaoh's response basically is, right from the get-go, he says, the Lord? Who is he? Who is the God that you're speaking about? And he's oblivious to the God of the Bible. And even right at the beginning of Moses' interaction with Pharaoh, Pharaoh shows he's very concerned about the economy. He doesn't care about God, but he's very concerned that the workers are stopping working. The children of Israel are stopping working because Moses is talking to them. So because Pharaoh has said no, Moses is instructed by God to tell Pharaoh that there are going to be a series of plagues or difficulties, blows is another way to say it, like a boxer landing blows on his opponent, that there would be these plagues that would come on Egypt. The first plague, the waters in the Nile and all the ponds and rivers in Egypt becomes blood. Then after that, frogs came up out of the river all over the land. And it's interesting too that the plagues affected everybody in Egypt, not just the lower classes, but Pharaoh himself was affected. All people were affected. The third plague was a plague of lice,
Yeah.
You've had your kids come home from school with lice, and imagine everybody in our country having lice at the same time. Then there was a plague of flies. And then God begins to send plagues that take the economy of Egypt apart. First, there's a disease upon the livestock, and many of them die. Then there's a plague of boils. Again, it's on Pharaoh and all the people of Israel. Then there's a plague of hail, and that destroys all the crops in the field, the early crops in the field, and all the trees in Egypt. Then there's a plague of locusts, and they eat everything really that wasn't destroyed by the hail and kill other animals, not livestock animals, but kill other animals. Then did you know there was actually a lockdown, Steve, in the 10 plagues? Because the 9th plague was a plague of darkness, and it says that for 3 days, everyone stayed in their place, in their homes, and they couldn't go and see anybody.
That's rough. That's rough.
Yeah. So they experienced a little of what we're experiencing now. And then the last plague was the worst. It was definitely the worst. And that was the firstborn of every family died.
Yeah.
And God foretold that this would happen. He said, all the firstborn will die. And he says, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave who is behind the handmill, and
death like we haven't experienced.
Yeah.
What we're going through right now is nothing compared to what the Egyptians went through during the 10 plagues.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. As rough as the coronavirus is, it is nothing compared to what the 10 plagues were and what the Egyptians went through.
Right.
But I do think there's some lessons that we can pull from it. One is that God again and again through the passage that talks about the 10 plagues, he tells them what he was up to in that whole time. And he says, first of all, I want everyone to know that I am God. He says that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And God, in contrast to the idea of like a Greek god who has a bad day and, sends punishment on people just because he's having a bad day. God is very purposeful in sending these plagues into Egypt. He wants them to know that he is God. And in fact, later on, he says that against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And each of the plagues related to a god in the Egyptian pantheon that the Egyptians worshipped and they trusted in. The frogs, there was a frog god, a god that related to the frogs. The firstborn, of course, Pharaoh was regarded as a god himself, and the god of the firstborn. All of these were Egyptian gods, and God literally made a show of these gods. The God of the Bible literally made a show of these false gods in Egypt. And his message to them was, to an advanced, wealthy, powerful civilization is, I am the true God. I am here, and I want you to know me.
Right.
Is his message to them, and again, does the Bible say anything about COVID? Well, no, it doesn't per se, but we see, as Steve has mentioned, we see fear mentioned in the Bible, and then we see similar illnesses, similar difficulties coming into the lives, not only of individuals, but of whole nations, whole civilizations.
Yeah.
And God has a purpose in that.
One of the plagues was a virus that affected all of Egypt.
Yeah.
And so conditions that are not wholly unlike what we're experiencing right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And so really what we can see through the plagues of Egypt is that God has a purpose when difficulties come into our life. And one of his greatest purposes is to show us the folly, the foolishness of trusting in false gods. And, we do that in 2020 in our world, in Ireland, in the Western world, around the world. We trust in false gods. They may not be idols or a little statue that we worship, but, materialism, pleasure, sometimes, academics and thinking that we have a superior way of looking at the world. Those things can be false gods in our world, in our economy. And sometimes something like the coronavirus comes into our lives, something we can't control, something that messes up our lives, wrecks our economy. And that's serious. That's difficult. Yeah. But if we can turn to God and say, oh, God is there. He is in control. He has allowed this. There can actually be some good takeaways from a horrible time like we're experiencing in the coronavirus. So, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the really big lessons from the plague is that God was revealing himself, who he was. And in order to do that, he did have to destroy the false gods of Egypt. And, we can relate that to our lives today. No, we're not experiencing the 10 plagues. We're probably not going to see the Red Sea parted in our lifetime and see the Israelites coming over the Red Sea. We are seeing plague in our lifetime. And people back in history have seen plagues. And we can learn the same lesson that the Egyptians learned and that the Israelites learned, and that's that God is in control. And one thing that we can say is either God is causing this pandemic for his purpose, or he is allowing it.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we just have to say, we're going to leave it in God's hands, and we don't know the exact purpose for this virus, but we have to realize that we are not in control like we thought we were.
Yeah.
And one thing God is doing through this pandemic, we see this all over the world, and he is telling the nations to turn to him, basically. Through the pandemic, he is trying to turn the nations to him. And as we look around the globe right now, there are very few, if any, governments that are actively seeking righteousness and to lead people in righteousness to seek after God. Virtually no government in
Yeah,
the world is
yeah.
doing this. No nation, by and large, is really trying to serve God. So we don't have our eyes on God. We have our eyes down on temporal things, on our
Yeah.
circumstances. And what God is saying through the pandemic is take your eyes off of the circumstances around you,
Yeah.
take your eyes off of the death and off of all of the fear and look to him.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's what fear does. I think fear is a tool that God uses to reveal to us what our false gods are. And Oriel, you mentioned this, and
Yeah.
that we all have false gods. And it may be our retirement account. Maybe that's our false god. Maybe that's what we're placing our trust in. And
Yeah.
when that's gone tomorrow, it throws my life into chaos and fear. And so
Yeah.
that fear teaches me what my false God was, what I was trusting in that was not God. And whether it's the coronavirus or any trial that we might be going through, God is trying to teach us to, well, first of all, he's trying to expose our false gods, and he's trying to teach us to take our eyes off of those things, to quit trusting in those false gods, and to look up
Yes.
and to trust in him. And God really wants us to find our trust in him and our source of enjoyment, our fulfillment in him. And Oriel, we're going to talk about that more as we go along.
Yes. Yes.
About
Yeah.
this relationship with
Yeah.
God.
And I definitely see what you're saying, even in the story of the 10 plagues, because you see Pharaoh at the beginning, you think he's a powerful monarch, leader of a nation.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, he says, "Who is the Lord? No, I'm not going to let your people go, Moses,"
Right.
And at the end, tragically, he's lost his firstborn child. And he says to Moses, "Yes, you may now go." But he said, "Will you bless me?" He actually asks Moses to bless him, presumably in the name of God. So here's a man who's gone to being totally, God is just not a part of what he thinks about, to at the end, he's at least admitting, I need God's blessing in my life. He's been through such a difficult time. And even there's a whole group, the Bible tells us, that left, of Egyptians that actually left Israel, not Israel, sorry, Egypt. They left Egypt with the children of Israel to go to Canaan. And their motivation seems to be that they had seen the plagues. They had seen all of this happen. They had seen the Egyptian gods literally taken apart. Everything they trusted in had been taken from them, and their way of life had been upended. And their conclusion was, this is the God I want to follow, the God that has done all this. And they leave Egypt and they follow the true God. And I think, wow, the coronavirus, as awful as it is, and again, it's nothing compared to the 10 plagues of Egypt, but as challenging as it is, if people in Ireland and around the world can turn to God and say, I want to follow, we are not in control, and there's nothing we can do, but I want to follow the God who is in control. If that were to happen, the coronavirus will, again, it'll have had some good benefits and takeaways, and that's my prayer.
One popular Bible teacher said, "Don't waste your cancer."
Yeah.
We could say, "Don't waste the virus." What is God trying to do? And think of the coronavirus as God's way of waking us up to the fact that He is in control. And don't waste this time. Maybe use this time to look to Him and say, God, I haven't found my trust and my strength in you, but I need to. And recognize that He is in control and that we don't have the control that we maybe thought we did.
Yes. And if you have questions and you're thinking about what we've talked about, both last week and this week, we've talked about a relationship with God and the reality that anyone can have that relationship. Again, just want to remind you that November 2nd, we are starting a new Bible study at Faith on Fire Ireland. It's called The Exchange. It's a 4-lesson Bible study. You can do it from your own home. We'll be doing it on Zoom. And in that Bible study, we'll talk about how to know God in a personal way. And maybe as you look at your life changing, there are worries, there are challenges there. Maybe you're someone who the coronavirus has affected profoundly, and you're saying, I need something in my life. Well, this Bible study may be a help to you in knowing God and having that personal relationship with Him. Again, you can check the website and particularly go on to the Facebook page, and you will see there at the top of the Faith on Fire Ireland Facebook page a little ad that talks about the Exchange Bible Study, and there is a link where you can register for the Bible study, and we will get you out a booklet, or you can download the class notes from the website. But we would love to try to be a help to you in your relationship with God. And also next week, we are looking forward to episode 3, where we will be interviewing a mom who has faced some remarkable challenges because of COVID, but she's also the mother of 6 young children, and she actually homeschools full time. She teaches those kids at home, not just because of the coronavirus. And she's going to talk about how her relationship with Christ makes an impact on her daily life and the difference it can make for all of us. So thank you for joining us this week as we've talked about what the Bible says about the coronavirus. So we trust that you will join us next week for episode 3.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
Be sure to catch us on Facebook, YouTube, and also the audio-only podcast on Apple iPod. We're also on Spotify now. So, okay.
Very good.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for joining us tonight.
God bless.